Natasha. My name is Siobhan. I work in the John Lewis Partnership. Over the last couple of years, I've worked in the resourcing manager role, and most recently moved into strategy and policy manager and talent acquisition.
Thank you. Simon, yourself.
Hi, thanks, Natasha. So yeah, I'm Simon. I'm talent assessment manager at Vodafone, so looking after assessments for all different roles, entry-level roles, senior roles, and some niche roles as well. I work in a global role, so support all of Vodafone's markets that we operate in, predominantly across Europe and Africa. And I look at assessments across both talent acquisition and talent development as well, so look at things from those angles. That's me.
Well.
Yes, indeed.
Alan, yourself.
Thank you, Natasha. Yeah, so I'm Alan Bourne. I'm founder and CEO at Sova, and we work with enterprise organisations, basically helping them manage their assessment pipeline from sort of application through to hiring, very focused on diversity, quality of hire, and experience.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to start us off with, and Alan, I'm going to come to you first to set the scene a little bit to the current market, the current talent landscape, and obviously it's highly competitive at the moment. And I think the first question I'd really like to pose to you is, in today's competitive landscape, how can organisations differentiate themselves to hire that top talent that is always up for grabs?
Yeah, thank you, Tasha. So I think you alluded earlier, I think, to the sort of some of the aspects of that current environment where for some roles that there's still lots of high volume hiring happening, and for other roles it's really hard to find people in the first place. In both situations, having a really kind of clear experience which is fast, drives time to hire, isn't sort of burdensome for the candidate is absolutely essential. So I think, when you think about employer brand, lots of organizations are focused on trying to get their EVP right, but then delivering that as soon as candidates get into the process can be quite challenging, especially if you've got different assessment tools people are using or interviews in different ways, and just trying to make that coherent and fast, but get really good talent fairly is quite a big challenge. So I think in terms of differentiating, that's for us the sort of thing to focus on. Is think about how do you make sure you've got a unified experience, which is using data intelligently and means that you can drive, great DEI outcomes at the same time as finding the best talent quickly. If you get it right, that means recruiters have more time, which is a fairly glorious thing to have if you're a recruiter, to actually have a bit of headroom to do the job really well, as opposed to be chasing your tail. So I think that's the kind of conundrum really that is important to address.
Yeah, and in terms of how you can utilize that sort of the insights, the data insights, especially around assessments, how can organizations start using that in a bit more of a sort of clever way to help deliver that great candidate experience? Yeah,
sure. So I think there's maybe, if we just pick up on the DEI point for a second, one of the things that can happen is if you make a reasonably good fist of attracting diverse talent at the top of your funnel, you still need to make sure you're, pulling people through that experience effectively and making sure your decisions are really good quality. And thirdly, that candidates feel that that's what's going on. So if you're using your data intelligence, you should be looking at how fair and effective are all of the steps through the process, particularly the interviews as well as the assessments, right? To all of that. Are we happy that we really have got the right profile for, what does good look like for this particular job type or this job type, and what does potential look like? Are we using data to create a loop and inform that continuously so that we're always improving and getting better? And if you're doing that well, you should also be getting feedback on candidates' views on the experience and looping that in about how do we make this, meaningful, give really good feedback, make sure that it's streamlined and gives a clear sort of preview of the organization. So that those are some of the ways that I think data should be used. Often it sort of feels like we're too busy and we're just trying to get everybody through the process, or we're desperate to find someone. And if you can use your data, in a slightly more standardized manner, then you can maybe get in front of that issue. And I think that's where being data driven is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Siobhan and Simon, is there anything else that you wanted to sort of add around the sort of current landscape and how to use assessments for that better candidate experience?
Just touching on the first point there around differentiating yourself in top talent, I think we've had quite a focus at JLP on our partnership purpose and very much linking that to the employee value proposition, and what Alan just said there around, how do you tie it all in, both from an attraction perspective, but both through that by the time you come into the organisation and finding out, the reality then of how that job's going to be. So we do really try and link everything back to our partnership purpose and commerciality as a business, and that's from an advertising perspective on our jobs and our social content. You might see some of our hashtags driven by purpose or find you're happier to ultimately define what we're working towards and what we're striving for, and really trying to buy into candidates or get candidates to buy into us. The difference between those passive and active candidates, that we try to do things differently, and here's why we want you to come and work with us.
I'd probably just echo both Alan's and Siobhan's points. I think for me, it's probably seeing that assessment experience as a two-way process. Like I know for a lot of the countries we operate in, candidates will have 5 or 6 job offers at the same time to choose from. And it's how do you differentiate what people think about the organization, not just in terms of your EVP and the stuff they see on the surface, but actually once you've gone through an interview with a hiring manager, I think that really tells you a lot about that organization. So really using that two-way process for candidates, and to Alan's point, where you can, have that automated feedback, really show interest in people's development and their views on the process, rather than just that kind of traditional one way, we're using this to select people. People are also using it to select you or somebody else.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point there, Simon. It's not just a one-way process that perhaps it has been in sort of recent times. And Siobhan, you just sort of touched on it a moment ago, and I think it was more from the sort of candidate buy-in side, but actually I want to bring it into the internal sort of buy-in and the stakeholder engagement, because I know from all of the other events that we do, often in-house recruiters have a big challenge in trying to get that buy-in and get that engagement, which often you need that to be able to make a success of any sort of project that you're doing. So Simon, I'm going to come to you and just ask you a question, because obviously, especially on a global scale, I'm sure there's different challenges with different sort of processes and getting that buy-in. How does Vodafone and sort of you specifically engage those internal stakeholders to embrace changes, especially within that assessment and recruitment practices in a global role?
Yeah, I think we're quite lucky that I think we're an organization that likes change and likes to keep doing things differently, and that has some benefits but also has some challenges when maybe something is working and we've got this desire to change things. I think probably the most important bits for me, one is just including your stakeholders from different areas of a business or different countries early on in the process. So I think particularly for us, if we're selecting a new assessment vendor or a new tool or designing something new, actually involving them in, whether it's choosing that vendor or designing what something looks like in the first place, I think that really helps. And you always get bits of feedback from everyone that you would never have thought of yourself. So just that getting, different views and more people in a room with, brings more intelligence, more thought to the process, I think. The other bit for me is like we're a complex organization, right? We've got, so many different countries, so many different needs. A hiring context is different in every country as well. And I think it's accepting that. So I think if I was sitting here saying, hey, when we rolled out, the transparency Sova's platform, it was never as smooth. It landed perfectly from day one in every single country. So actually appreciating that it's complex. Some countries will need to go slower, some countries will want to go fast, and within those countries there'll even be nuances for different business areas as well. So I think accepting that for us, and accepting that stakeholders will need a different pace of change depending on their local context, and having those open discussions with them. And I think the other bit, just really listening to people about their needs and what they're after, what our HR leadership team will say is important for them in terms of a new tool or product. is different to what our talent acquisition teams doing the day-to-day will tell us. So actually, how are we listening to all of those different things and building that in, whilst also managing expectations? As you know, with launching any new product, it's never a fully integrated perfectly and seamless on day one, but managing those steps and kind of going along on the journey, I think, with everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this, some of the key words that you mentioned there was around sort of communication and just having that constant dialogue and that sort of communication with the different stakeholders and getting them involved. Have you got any examples of where you've had that sort of successful change communication strategies that Vodafone have sort of deployed to ensure that smooth adoption of new practices?
Yeah, I think obviously I won't go into like, you know, the basic, this is when we communicate before something goes out. I think most people will be aware of that, but I think it's probably the important bit for us is making sure that people feel that they're not being, change isn't being done to them, so they're actually involved in it. So probably a few key bits for us is we might tailor a central communication, for example, about a product or tool, but then allow the local markets to decide how they want to tailor that, tweak that locally based on their needs. So really letting them decide how they're going to communicate that out themselves in their markets. I think the second bit as well is making the information and any communication available at the right time. So not necessarily just saying, let's take an example for hiring managers. Hiring managers want to know about what's available when they're hiring for something. They don't necessarily need to know a year in advance. Hey, we've changed this tool. If I'm not going to hire for 6 months or 12 months, I probably don't want to and don't need to know that far in advance. So that's one of the things for us, is just linking that kind of just-in-time communication when they've got a requisition or a conversation with a recruiter. That's when they'll find out more about products and services. And probably the most powerful one for us is using testimonials from people internally. So when we've got any kind of new tool or product, I think the most powerful thing is somebody that's gone through that process or somebody that's used that tool saying how they found it is much more convincing than me or somebody in the central COE telling people, hey, this is a great tool. So that'd be my third tip.
Yeah, excellent. And in terms of using one specific platform at a global level, obviously you're going to have the sort of nuances in the sort of local areas. What are some of the benefits that you've been able to sort of leverage by having that one platform, you know, for assessment specifically, across the different sort of locations globally?
Yeah, I'd probably flag we don't have just one platform now, because we've got some niche specific needs like software engineering and technology hires. But I think generally for us, about reducing the number of vendors and the number of platforms that we use. The first is fairly obvious one, right? Vendor optimization, reduced costs. You know, you're not paying multiple vendors for multiple things. So I think that's one key benefit. The second for me is you're not spending loads of time training your talent acquisition communities on 3 or 4 different vendors and different tools. There's a simplification on what's on offer. So if I go back to 2, maybe 3 years ago at Vodafone, we had probably thousands of different types of assessments somebody could choose from, and it literally covered everything. But when you narrowed it down and did some analysis on what was being used, there was only really about 10 assessments across the business being used. So we're getting lots of, I suppose, confusion from people going, what are these 40 different cognitive assessments do I use? So I think simplifying that for users as well is really important. So yeah, those are the main benefits, I would say, in terms of having a smaller number of vendors.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think we touched on it a little bit there, is about looking at the data and looking at what people are using, which sort of ties us in quite nicely. It was like we planned this, wasn't it? Ties us in quite nicely to Siobhan and some of the work that you've been doing around those sort of data-driven decisions to make more sort of strategic decisions as well there. So I know that you've recently just with Sova conducted an assessment audit. So what kind of insights and how did you gain from doing that audit? around the sort of assessment process and the overall performance, and how have you been able to sort of leverage what you found?
So we have worked with Sova for a number of years on various projects across talent acquisition and more broadly across our people space. But specifically over the last few years, we've really specifically recognised that we need to make some significant changes in how we operate in the talent acquisition space, and in particular our internal talent acquisition team and how we're set up. And fundamentally that comes back to how do we assess candidates, what tools do we use, what online assessments do we use, what interview packs, and how does all that form the end-to-end approach and experience that a candidate will go through. So we kicked off a project with Sova about 18 months ago. And they facilitated some internal sessions with us, with our TA team, hiring managers and candidates and other internal key stakeholders. And that was really to holistically explore what works well fundamentally in our approach, and where are our weaknesses, and where is there some real sticking points, particularly around the experience at that point. It was, you know, anecdotal feedback that we were getting at that point, and then we supplemented that with some hard data. So the output of that audit really highlighted many of the complexities that we had known to have built over the years in the form of policies or processes, which you know, at the time served their purpose, but as we had evolved as a business, started to put a real detriment on the experience of hiring managers and candidates. And it felt from their perspective that recruitment became a chore and something that wasn't as enjoyable. There was assumptions around the time taken, the complexity of it. So we really wanted to get into tackling some of that. So additionally, looking at some of that data, we found that we could be using our online assessments in a better, more simplistic way. So we used that really as a starting point to simplify our approach and where we wanted to go from there. So through the feedback sessions, there was a lot of key nuggets of information that we captured, that Sova captured from stakeholders, and we had a session with our leadership team to then start to explore what is the opportunities and what are some of the solutions for some of these pain points, be that removing some complexities or unnecessary steps in the process, and really exploring how we can better use tech to enable and drive some of the efficiencies. Maybe that was through a manual process that we were doing, and so we started to build our roadmap of change, and that's where we are heading over the next 12 to 18 months.
Excellent. So really those that insight was able to sort of garner those conversations with sort of senior leadership and actually get that buy-in that obviously Simon was just sort of talking on in a bit more detail there. And I know you've got some examples of 3 Bs, build, borrow and buy, and how they've influenced your sort of TA strategy, and how have they contributed to the success of the organisation? Perhaps you want to sort of touch on some of those examples.
I wouldn't say we fundamentally do anything different than anything that I've seen externally in other companies that we've done through some engagement sessions, but we do put quite a particular focus on some key areas depending on the transformation area of the business that we're focusing on. So from a build perspective, for example, across our people teams, we've got a really great network of talent acquisition and L&D leaders to help grow and develop our pipeline of talent that we've got internally, ultimately investing in the skills of the partners that we've got with us. We do that through, for example, apprenticeships, be that across retail, finance, leadership. We've got some vehicle tech ones as well, which is ultimately very closely linked to our internal progression. So we also have this in a less formal apprenticeship way as such, and opportunities such as aspiring people manager or leadership development courses that we've ran in the past, and encouraging others to join mentorships or coaching bank, either as someone who wants to facilitate that or be a coach themselves. We've also really developed some fantastic internal resources, for example, the Career Hub that any partner can go on, evaluate where they're at in their career at any point, and look and see what other opportunities are out there for me and what chances have I got to drive my career. So as part of our people manager development courses that we've run and facilitated with the wider people function, we've got thousands of people managers across the UK. We've worked with Sova to develop a tool for people managers, similar to how some of the assessment methods that we use in recruitment, but in this case more focused on development to help people managers understand their strengths and development areas, and that has then really given us some rich insight into how we continue to build our approach further in that space and where we've got opportunities to do so. With the seasonal nature, we are majoritively a retail company. So with the seasonal nature of our recruitment peak across the year plays some key activities into how we explore projects and what we know is coming down the pipeline. And where we know that we don't have the resources in-house or the skills in-house to deliver, we know that we'll need to recruit to buy in some of those skills or resources. So sometimes in the volume space, this means recruiting partners for shops or other business areas to deliver some key transformation. But this might also mean looking at some other opportunities. So we've really focused on buying in key ownership of skills and activities where we know that we don't fully have that developed in-house, but where we know that that's quite key to our strategy. So for example, in our Lean, Simple, Fast strategy on business transformation, to simplify how we want to work. And finally, from a borrow angle, similar to many other organisations out there, depending on costs and timelines, we might look to explore contractors.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that, Siobhan. Really interesting. And I'd really like to just sort of carry on the conversation around that sort of data-driven and adaptive approach that we've just been talking about, and kind of open it up to both Simon and Alan there as well, because I think there's, in a number of our events, we get challenges and we get questions around how to use data. So a lot of people will have a lot of data at their fingertips. They don't necessarily know what to do with it. So Simon, perhaps I'll come to you and just sort of ask you around how have you used sort of data, whether locally or on a global scale, to drive some of those recruitment and specifically assessment decisions that you're making?
Yeah, good question. I don't think anybody's nailed this yet, this question. And I think if anybody has, please get in touch with us and tell us how you've done it. But I think for us, it's really, yeah, in all seriousness, I think putting the building blocks in place, right? So I think one of the challenges we had 18 months ago, 2 years ago, was actually even accessing the data in the first place. And that goes back to kind of that vendor simplification piece I was talking about. So the first bit is, can you get the data and how easily accessible is it for you as an organization? And then I think it's just really understanding what you want to do with it. So our first bit for us, some of the bits we do currently and have done, is understanding those bits around fairness. So actually looking at our tools and looking at the different assessment scores for different groups and seeing, is that fair? I think then the next part for us around that is actually looking at it from a predictive lens. So actually, are people that are scoring better in these assessments staying in the business for longer, more engaged, performing better, whatever metrics important for your organization? And I think as well, at a more basic level, just understanding, are people actually using those assessments to make decisions? So, you know, in a lot of cases, we will have people using assessments, but actually, are the people doing better in those assessments, whether it's an interview, whether it's an online assessment, are they the people actually being hired for the organization? And that sounds like a real basic thing, like, of course, but actually, I think a lot of people will find if you look at your data and start doing that analysis, you'll find, oh, actually, maybe we're not hiring people that are performing better in the assessments for various reasons. So those are the bits from a talent acquisition perspective. I also kind of put my how do we use assessments for development purposes hat on here as well, and similar things. Actually, an assessment is an assessment, right? It's not useful unless you're using it for some kind of decision or outcome or development support. So for us, it's really framing it for that individual level development. So like Siobhan was just mentioning, how do the assessment results link somebody to coaching or link somebody to specific learning content if they're an internal colleague, particularly if you've got internal candidates, this can be really powerful as well if they're not successful. And the other bit for us around data is actually what insight are we then giving to different teams about the makeup at an aggregated level of our population and our employees using the assessments that people have gone through. So I know that's not specifically recruitment, but I think it's important how recruitment and the development side of the assessments you use link together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is really key to be able to link them. So I'm glad you've sort of touched on both sides of that there. Alan, is there anything that you'd like to add on to onto what Simon just mentioned?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Simon's articulated some of the absolutely some of the key challenges there. I think there's probably a connection to draw between some of the discussion that both Siobhan and Simon shared about the process of engaging all various different stakeholder groups, and it's obviously quite pluralist. You've got leadership, and you've got hiring managers, and you've got candidates, and you've got to sort of make all of that work. If you kind of force these things through, to Simon's point, you can end up sort of deploying something that nobody uses properly, which is, you know, that's probably sort of a pretty terrible outcome. It's really important that you've engaged your stakeholders as well as use the data to analyse, are we delivering the key outcomes? What do you actually care about? Is that DEI outcomes, quality of hire, you know, retention, for example? And also, are we kind of seeing growth of individuals developing in doing well in the organisation? Is the workforce growth? I think if you're really clear about the outcomes rather than getting caught up in the process side, that's a great place to start to really use the data. And typically good adoption goes hand in hand with good outcomes. It's quite hard to get to good outcomes without really getting the adoption bit right. So I think all of the points around change management that my fellow panelists have said, I think are super important to bear in mind. And that's all part of getting your hands on that data in the first place and then getting to a place that you can use it.
Yeah. And Siobhan, I was going to ask a sort of similar question to yourself, but in terms of getting that data, and I know obviously you work with Sova in the audit assessment and that data being provided to you, on a day-to-day basis, is it yourself that sort of looks at that data and gathers that data? Do you have someone in your team? How does that sort of data collection and analysis work from that side? Because I think that's where a lot of people fall down in being able to perhaps not have that skill and they don't know where to get that from.
It's a bit of a combination of all of the above. Data is quite a heavy part of my role, but also we do have an in-house data team in our talent acquisition function. That was only a recently new concept to us. I say that maybe like 6 years ago. We originally had a people data team, and specifically we were finding it a real challenge to get quality talent acquisition data around the recruitment process. So we brought that in-house, which has made an amazing transformation in the quality of data that we've got. However, we then went through a phase of having too much data and having so many variations, and how many ways do you cut the pie, and different stakeholders requiring different iterations. So through our transformation in the last kind of 12 months, we're using new tools. We're setting some standardised definitions of this as the key metrics that we will use, so that we are all taking the same information, taking it from the same cut, and taking, you know, everyone will come out with their own conclusions and interpretations of what that data, but it's all from the one version of the truth as opposed to so many variations of that.
Yeah, that's really so key, because I know that so many people have so many different data, so much data from so many different data sources as well. They just go, I don't know what to do with it, and I can't make sense of it. So sort of leading on to the next question that we have is, for anyone that is on this journey to taking a more sort of data-driven approach, does anyone have any sort of best practices or sort of top tips, recommendations on how they get started or really make the most of that journey? Alan, I can see you nodding, so I'm going to come to you first there.
Sure. I mean, I think some of the points have been made about having access to the information is obviously a fundamental, in both Siobhan and Simon mentioned that. I think building on that, again, the points like Siobhan said around having a data team, I think that's increasingly becoming, more commonplace, and people are like, oh, hang on, we need people that are good at doing the analytics. As being a sort of statsy person doing the analysis is not the same, kind of career path as running a resourcing function necessarily. Obviously, lots of people can learn to know what questions to ask and how to interpret, but having some specialists generally is a great idea. They're not any help to you though, unless you work out what you want them to find out for you. So I think the responsibility for talent functions is what outcomes they're interested in and what they want to investigate and measure, and then taking the right action about getting the specialist individuals you might need to sort of form that capacity. So I think, there's in both John Lewis and in Vodafone, there's good examples of that happening, of getting the right mix of skill sets that you need.
Brilliant. Simon or Siobhan, anything that you'd like to add on to that one?
I'd probably just add two small points to what Alan's mentioning. I think when we are on this journey rather than, have finished this journey and it's all perfect. But I think the bit for us is like, what questions are we trying to answer in the first place? I think once you know that, you can start to map out what that journey looks like. And I think just starting and starting small, I think, because our heads, like from this discussion, goes straight to that predictive analytics and all the stuff that is much more difficult to do, but much more kind of a golden goose that we're after. But actually, it might be that the starting point is how many, how often, have assessments been done, which isn't as glamorous in terms of data, but it's a starting point on that journey. And I'd echo the point about, we have data scientists too that will work towards like creating dashboards and things like that, which is super helpful.
Brilliant. We are on our sort of final formal question that we've got. So anyone that does have any questions for our panelists, do start popping them into the chat function, or we've got a Q&A function as well. So we've probably got another sort of 5 minutes or so of questions, and then we can open it up to the open Q&A. So obviously one of the challenges that we saw as a part of the poll question was around attracting diverse applicants. So Alan, you touched on it at the very beginning. So attracting diverse applicants is absolutely brilliant, but making sure that the assessment process is fair and sort of fostering inclusivity is really, really key. What ways and how have you ensured that sort of recruitment and assessment practices promote that diversity and inclusion piece? Alan, again, you're nodding, so I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, sure. Essentially, there's a piece there around measuring all of the steps of selection. So I guess there were probably, if you went back maybe 10, 15 years, people might measure like one bit. They'll look at, a particular test they're using and say, is that fair or not, or whatever. And I think the whole industry is in a good way moved on a bit to kind of go, well, we need to look at how we're using these things in combination. Are we using a blended assessment to sort of screen people? How are we using video interviews or regular interviews with hiring managers in measuring all of the steps and the overall outcome? And I think some of the best work we've been involved in that has looked at the aggregate effect of, once people have been attracted to apply, what does that profile look like? And are we ensuring that we are, as a minimum, pulling that through proportionally? So the who we're hiring, we haven't got spots of bias here, or you can have sort of incremental bits of bias in a process where it's not quite big enough to be legally a problem, but if you do it 5 times in a row, it kind of is. So to make sure, are all of the steps working? Do we need to get hiring managers to do it better? Do we need to balance out how we're putting assessment tools together to get the right outcome? I mean, that's fundamentally a analysis process. It's not madly complicated, but some of the points that my colleagues have made, you need to have all of that information. So you can analyze it. And once you start doing that routinely, you can make the sort of final mile really to getting genuine fairness really needs that to happen. And
adapt to every single sort of area where there might be a challenge. And Siobhan, what about yourself? Because obviously throughout this sort of audit that you worked with Sova on, were there some of these instances where it came that perhaps areas needed changing at all, and how have you sort of dealt with those?
Yeah, the main areas that came out through the audit were more around simplification and standardisation of what we were doing, but more holistically than that, I think through over the last, certainly since I've been in role over the last few years, focus on adverse impact. So building on just what Alan said, looking at the particular parts of the process individually, but also holistically around the adverse impact that any screening, any interview process has. And you can look at that as a chunk of activity in that process, or look at the individual items, for example, the individual questions that you ask down to that level, or the individual questions positioned in a blended assessment. So I think that is really a good starting point to highlight any bias in the selection process and challenge yourself on the integrity of that process and look to make adjustments where it's required. And a standard practice around offering reasonable adjustments through the process, focusing on the barrier that individual faces. And I think being upfront and transparent on your career page can really help candidates get the best solution for that candidate. And I hear so regularly that candidates just aren't clear on what questions or what adjustments they can ask for, don't know what adjustments are. So we're certainly on that build, on that journey as well from our career page on JLP Jobs to help explain and set process expectations and what help is available.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Really, really key. Simon, what about yourself? And obviously on a global scale, I know there's perhaps some sort of nuances in sort of disclosing information and what data you're able to collect as well. So it'd be interesting to hear how you deal with that.
Yeah, no, good question. I think I would agree with all of the points that Adam and Siobhan have mentioned already. I think globally it's then, it depends on the tools that we're using. Is this a tool where we're looking to compare people across different countries? So if I took a cognitive assessment, I'd feel uncomfortable, for example, using a verbal reasoning assessment for people in lots of different countries if we're asking them to do that in English, for example. So what assessments are more cross-cultural and can be applied across cultures? I think using local norm groups as well for us, so making sure, South Africa legally needs to have its own norm group, but even so for other countries, actually, it's just good practice to make sure we're comparing people from the countries that they're in. The only other bits, but yeah, there's lots of other intricacies and complexities of the kind of global having that consistency whilst making sure the assessments are still inclusive globally. Yeah, the other bits I would probably add, one is just around attraction. So not being an attraction expert, but are we actually going to the right places to attract people to really get a diverse range of candidates in? And we had an example last year with our Ethiopia market, wanted to attract people basically outside of the capital. So the capital was fine for internet connectivity, getting people to complete the assessments, but they really wanted to go out to local villages where internet connection wasn't good, and how could they get people into the process. I think that was a really nice example where they went out, got people into local libraries, tweaked the assessment process so it was easy enough to go through while still having those best practice principles to comparing candidates. The other bit, which I think kind of links to one of the points right at the beginning around not having the funds or the budget for assessments, is actually, there's loads of good resources on this, and like inclusion nudges by design, where actually it's just building some simple things into your current processes that are free, that don't cost any money. So yeah, we have a lot of conversations about, what are the fanciest, shiniest tools to use that are really fair, but actually sometimes it's, well, are you using a rating scale in your interviews? And yeah, it's not as glamorous, but actually it's probably much more effective than anything we can do that's really, that's got a high cost. So that would be my other bit to look at throughout your process. Actually, where are there quick wins that will make the process more inclusive without the person doing the interviewing or the assessing even needing to think about it? So yeah, those would be my additionals.
Excellent, thank you.